Adrian Newey was supposed to save Aston Martin. Instead, Bahrain may have exposed a fatal flaw in his first car. 3 days of testing. Just 206 laps completed. A full engine replacement on day 2. Emergency cooling cuts made in the garage. And a driver admitting they are 4 seconds off the pace. 4 seconds. In modern Formula 1, that is a disaster. This was the Dream Alliance. Newey, Honda, Aston Martin. A championship blueprint on paper. But in Bahrain, the AMR26 was overheating, clipping on the straights, and running in reduced power mode just to survive. Telemetry shows they were losing 15 km per hour on the straights. The battery running out 200 meters before braking zones. That is not a small issue. That is structural failure. And the most shocking part? If the chassis is too tight for proper cooling, this cannot be fixed with a small update. It requires redesign. Which means time. And time is exactly what they do not have. Stay with me, because what Newey's notes in that Bahrain garage really reveal could define Aston Martin's entire 2026 season. Subscribe now, because this story only gets bigger. Let us start with what actually happened the moment the AMR26 touched the track. Day 1 in Bahrain was supposed to be about validation, correlation, confidence. Instead, it became damage control almost immediately. Within the first sessions, engineers detected data anomalies coming from the Honda power unit. Not minor glitches. Systemic irregularities in the energy recovery system and thermal management. Under Bahrain's desert heat, the hybrid system failed to synchronize correctly with the combustion engine. Temperatures spiked. The car had to be shut down repeatedly to prevent catastrophic failure. That is not how a new era begins. And remember, this is not just any engine program. This is Honda's return in a full works partnership. This is Adrian Newey's first Aston Martin concept built around the 2026 regulations. Expectations were enormous. But by the end of day 1, optimism had already faded. Then came day 2. The moment that confirmed this was not a small issue. The entire power unit had to be replaced. Hours of running lost. Critical setup programs abandoned. And when the car finally returned to the track, it was running in safe mode. Engine revolutions capped at 11,000. Well below the 15,000 limit. That means the AMR26 was artificially restricted just to survive. But here is where the situation becomes more serious. This is not only an engine reliability story. It is a packaging story. Newey's design philosophy for the AMR26 follows an ultra-tight size zero concept. Aggressive bodywork. Extremely narrow sidepods. Minimal cooling volume. Aerodynamically brilliant on paper. But the 2026 hybrid units generate significantly more heat than previous generations. And the AMR26 simply could not dissipate that heat effectively. The emergency solution was dramatic. Inside the garage, mechanics literally cut additional cooling vents into the bodywork. Extra gills appeared on the side pods and engine cover. That is not refinement. That is improvisation. And every extra opening destroys aerodynamic efficiency. More drag. Less rear stability. Which means the car becomes slower and harder to drive. Now imagine being a driver in that situation. You are not chasing lap time. You are hoping the temperature alarms do not trigger again. And this is exactly what happened next. Telemetry revealed severe clipping on the straights. The battery was running out roughly 200 meters before braking zones. That means the car stopped accelerating while rivals continued pulling away. They were losing around 15 km per hour in straight line speed. That is not a small margin. That is massive in Formula 1 terms. And when Lance Stroll said they are 4 seconds off the pace, it was not exaggeration for drama. It was frustration rooted in reality. By the end of the 3 days, Aston Martin had completed just 206 laps. Compare that to teams surpassing 400 laps. That is half the data, half the learning, half the preparation. So block 1 of this story is clear. The AMR26 did not just struggle. It exposed a potential integration failure between chassis philosophy and hybrid reality. And when your problem is structural packaging in a cost cap era, the fix is never simple. Now we move to day 3. Because this is where the emotional weight of the crisis became visible. Fernando Alonso stepped into the car knowing the situation was already fragile. His role was not to chase performance. It was to gather whatever stability data remained possible. He completed 55 laps. But the lap times told a brutal story. 1 minute 38.9. More than 4 seconds off the front. And this was not because Alonso suddenly forgot how to drive. It was because the car could not operate at full capacity. Engine maps restricted. Battery deployment inconsistent. Cooling margins razor thin. Instead of exploring the limits of the chassis, Alonso was validating that the power unit would not shut down again. That is a psychological blow. For a driver chasing his 33rd career victory, starting a new era in survival mode is devastating. Observers inside the paddock noticed visible frustration. Gloves thrown aside. Lengthy, tense meetings with Honda engineers. Body language that did not suggest confidence. Now add another layer. Because Aston Martin had planned aerodynamic updates for the final day. A revised floor. A new front wing specification. None of it ran. The parts remained in their boxes. Why? Because there is no point validating aero gains when the engine cannot deliver consistent power. So now the consequences stack up. Limited mileage. No full race simulations. No accurate tire degradation data. Strategic preparation incomplete. They leave Bahrain not only slower, but strategically blind. And here comes the most dangerous question of all. What if the issue is not just overheating? What if the chassis is physically too tight for the thermal demands of the Honda hybrid system? If that is the case, you are not talking about a new cooling duct. You are talking about internal layout revision. Potentially structural modifications. That takes months. Not a week. Yes, Honda has immense resources. Yes, Newey is famous for solving complex aerodynamic puzzles. But even genius operates within physical constraints. And time is brutal in Formula One. Right now, Aston Martin are not preparing to challenge Red Bull or Ferrari. They are staring at a fight to escape the first qualifying session. Williams appear more stable. The midfield is tighter than ever. So this is not simply a slow start. It is a warning. A warning that the ambitious size zero concept may have gone too far. A warning that the integration between chassis and power unit has not worked under real-world heat. And perhaps most worrying of all, a warning that a championship dream project is beginning 2026 in crisis mode. Because if cooling and clipping are not solved immediately, Bahrain was not just a bad test. It was the first sign of a fundamental design conflict at the heart of the AMR26. Now we reach the part that truly puts Aston Martin in danger. Because crises in Formula One are not only technical. They are political. They are psychological. They are structural. Inside that Bahrain garage, two philosophies were colliding. The British chassis department. The Japanese power unit division. And when integration fails under pressure, tension follows. History has shown this before. McLaren and Honda lived through it. Blame shifting. Frustration. Development delays. The signs in Bahrain were subtle, but real. Adrian Newey standing quietly, taking rapid notes in front of a partially dismantled car. Engineers debating cooling thresholds. Alonso in extended closed-door meetings. This is not the atmosphere of a team confident in its direction. It is the atmosphere of a team trying to understand what went wrong. And here is the brutal truth. If the hybrid system overheats in Bahrain conditions, what happens in Saudi Arabia? What happens in Miami? What happens in Singapore? Heat is not going away. The 2026 engines produce even greater thermal loads than the previous generation. If the AMR26 cannot dissipate that heat without cutting open its own bodywork, then every hot race becomes a survival event. And survival racing does not win championships. Now consider the operational damage already done. 206 laps total. Half the mileage of front-running teams. No validated long-run tire data. No full power simulations. No confirmation that the aerodynamic concept works at maximum output. That means they arrive at race 1 still experimenting. Still guessing. Still managing temperatures instead of chasing lap time. And in modern Formula 1, falling behind early is dangerous. Because the cost cap limits how aggressively you can correct mistakes. You cannot redesign freely. You cannot overspend to accelerate recovery. Every redesign must fit inside strict financial boundaries. If the cooling architecture requires deeper modification, that consumes development budget, which delays aerodynamic progress, which delays performance upgrades, which compounds the deficit. This is how a promising project becomes trapped. And then there is Fernando Alonso. He did not sign up for a rebuilding phase. He signed up for a championship push, for a final shot at something historic. If the AMR26 remains unstable and underpowered, morale becomes another hidden problem. Because elite drivers sense direction quickly. They know when a project feels aligned. And they know when something fundamental is wrong. So now everything hinges on one question. Is this a temporary overheating issue? Or is the AMR26 fundamentally too extreme in its packaging to support Honda's hybrid reality? If it is temporary, Aston Martin can recover. Honda can redesign cooling pathways. Newey can rebalance aerodynamic surfaces once the bodywork is closed properly. Performance can return. But if the chassis concept itself is incompatible with the thermal demands of the engine, then Bahrain was not a bad week. It was an early warning of a season-long struggle. And perhaps the most painful part of all, this project was built to challenge Red Bull's new era dominance. Instead, after 3 days in the desert, Aston Martin are fighting overheating alarms, clipping on the straights, and a 4-second gap that feels impossible to ignore. So as the teams pack up and head toward the first race, one reality remains. The AMR26 is not just under pressure. It is under scrutiny. Because if the fatal flaw exposed in Bahrain is real, then 2026 will not begin as a championship campaign for Aston Martin. It will begin as a rescue mission. And this is where the story stops being technical and starts becoming existential. Because Formula One does not wait for recovery. It punishes hesitation. If Aston Martin begins the season fighting overheating and clipping, they will not just lose points. They will lose momentum. Momentum in a new regulation era is everything. Look at what Bahrain already revealed. 206 laps. That is not enough to fully understand tire degradation. Not enough to fine-tune suspension balance. Not enough to correlate wind tunnel data with real-world airflow. And certainly not enough to validate a radical aerodynamic concept built around extreme packaging. Meanwhile, rival teams completed more than double that mileage. They gathered long-run data. They optimized deployment maps. They refined setup windows. Aston Martin were cutting holes into bodywork just to keep the engine alive. That image matters. Because it symbolizes something deeper. The AMR26 was designed around perfection. Ultra-tight packaging. Minimal drag. Maximum aerodynamic efficiency. But perfection on paper does not survive thermal overload. If the cooling volume is insufficient, every race becomes a compromise. Open more vents. Lose downforce. Increase drag. Close the bodywork. Risk overheating. That is not a championship platform. That is a balancing act. And then comes the long-term consequence. If they must redesign internal cooling architecture, that consumes wind tunnel allocation. It consumes simulation time. It consumes cost cap budget, which means fewer performance upgrades later in the season. So even if they stabilize reliability, they may fall behind in pure development pace. This is how early flaws echo through an entire year. And here is the most uncomfortable layer. Adrian Newey rarely miscalculates. When his designs struggle, they usually have hidden potential. But even he cannot bend physics. If the 2026 Honda hybrid unit produces thermal loads beyond what the chassis can sustain, then the concept must evolve. And evolution takes time. Time Alonso does not have. Time Aston Martin's championship ambition cannot afford. So now the situation becomes brutally simple. If Bahrain was a temporary overheating anomaly, Aston Martin can recover.